Okay, corruption. Why am I going to give you a full snippet on corruption? Bunch of reasons. One, this is what I did my dissertation on. So this is something I'm particularly familiar with and interested in. Two, there's a chapter on non-democracies. And corruption is highly negatively correlated with non-democracy and all kinds of other bad things. What do we mean negatively correlated? That means the more corrupt you are, the less democratic you are. The more corrupt you are, the harder it is to become a democracy. The more corrupt you are, the harder it is to remain a democracy. The less corrupt you are, the easier it is to have a smooth democracy. The less corrupt you are, the easier it is to become a democracy. This arrow works both ways. Corruption can harm democracy. Democracy can reduce corruption. Non-democracy can increase corruption. The arrow works both ways. And corruption is understood to be a huge factor in other negative things like economic growth, health, education, all sorts of factors. The more corrupt you are, the less healthy your society is, the less educated your society, the less wealthy your society is, the worse your economy is in general. You get the idea. Well, corruption, it's definitely bad. That's why we're putting it in chapter 6. What is it? Okay. This is one place where an instance in which having a working definition is extremely useful. And so what has occurred in academia and in policy circles, anti-corruption policy circles, is that people have agreed on a definition, a rough definition. Almost everybody's definition looks something like this: the abuse of public or private power for personal gain. Yeah. That's just specific enough to distinguish corruption from other things, but it's general enough that you're going to be able to fit things into it. Okay? All right, so a few points about this definition. One of them, there's nothing in there about legality, something being legal or illegal. And quite often, the case is that legal acts are corrupt, or instances of corruption in this country or that country are actually totally legal. But that doesn't mean it's not corrupt. All right. The abuse of power. Abuse can mean different things to different people. But we can generally get a handle on that. Of public or private power. So if you're in the private sector, you can be corrupt. If you're in government, you can be corrupt. Sometimes people are both. For personal gain. Personal gain, we usually think about it in terms of wealth, right? Wealth, money, payola, bribes, right? That's easy to understand. But other personal gain would be anything that could help you. So, a sitting president abusing his power in order to win his next election, to win re-election, that counts as corruption, even if there's no money involved. Okay? If he is abusing his power and the purpose is personal, to gain personally by winning re-election, that's corruption. Okay? Does it have to be illegal? Nope. All right. So, it's a little bit more about what it is. The good news about corruption and anti-corruption reform is that it can work. It can work really, really well. A couple good historical examples. Um, well, the United States, for one. As corrupt as you may believe the United States is now, the United States historically was much more corrupt. And we had a few historical instances that helped us enact laws, change our culture, um, in order to become less corrupt. Some individuals you've heard of that were deeply, heavily involved in this: Teddy Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, um, before he became president, was played a significant role in reducing corruption at the time. Um, Robert F. Kennedy, when he was prosecuting the mafia, these very effective prosecutions led to anti-corruption reform being put, anti-corruption laws and regulations being put in place that have greatly reduced corruption overall in the United States over time. Globally, Singapore and Hong Kong, separately, of course, different decades. Hong Kong was first. They put into place an extremely effective anti-corruption reform that stuck. So Hong Kong went from being a very, very corrupt location to almost entirely lacking in corruption. Singapore did roughly the same thing a couple decades later. So it can work. So that's good news, right? The bad news is when you identify the things in those movements in other places that worked, and you take them and you try to replicate the magic, replicate those corruption reform programs in another country, they generally don't work. This is one of the things I found and looked at in my dissertation was, why is this? Why don't they work? Not only do they not work, everybody kind of knows they don't work. Not only did everybody knows they don't work, but they keep trying the same thing over and over again, hoping to get lucky, I guess. But they generally don't work. Well, what are these corruption reforms that are useful? That were useful in Hong Kong and Singapore and a few other places, and in theory should be useful anywhere you put them. One of them, there's sort of a laundry list. One of them is transparency in government. You want your government to be transparent. So records and data should be available. They should be done objectively, and they should be available. So a lot of times anti-corruption reforms, modern ones, were just things that look kind of small, and like public records being put online. Spending records, what the government is spending on this or that, that's made available online for citizens to access. So transparency. Related to transparency, you need a healthy open media. You need a media that's allowed to go out and collect the facts and is willing to go out and do them. And when they find the facts, they publish them, and hopefully that leads to new reforms and prosecutions and that sort of thing. So you need openness in general, transparency in general. You need a free media. Not everybody has that. The world's most famous, most effective anti-corruption NGO, many of you have heard of them, I'm sure, is called Transparency International. It's a global nonprofit group that attempts to shed light via research on and public campaigns on corruption in different countries, different types of corruption, but globally. And they do a number of indices that they put out every year, including the Corruption Perceptions Index, in which case, in which they rank basically every country in terms of corruption, the perceptions of corruption. Why the perceptions? Because it's really difficult to measure. in part because corruption thrives in the darkness. Um, these acts are either bad, oftentimes illegal. People don't want you to know they're doing them, so they hide them and they don't talk about them. So it's hard to get data on this sort of thing. So what Transparency International does is they just ask people, how often does this happen? How often? When was the last time you had to pay a bribe? How do you feel? Do you feel like your leadership is corrupt? That sort of thing. They ask citizens in these countries, and then they also ask citizens outside of the countries living elsewhere, and then they ask experts, and they kind of average it all together. Not a great system, but it's pretty good, and I'm not sure we can do better. So there's transparency, there's the need for an open media. You want an independent commission or ombudsman or something like that, something that's independent from the head of state, head of government, the president, the prime minister, or whatever. Some organization or group or even individual that is a watchdog and has independence and the ability to make suggestions, have those suggestions implemented into law, etc. That's a big one. You want a thriving civil society. You want local groups of citizens, even if they don't need to be anti-corruption citizen groups. They can be really any kind of citizen groups. Having a healthy civil society can help reduce corruption because citizens feel involved. They're not just saying inside. They feel like they're capable of making changes through citizen efforts. Okay, so that's something you want. You want to encourage that. Try to create that if you don't already have it. Not everybody has that. So you want judicial strength, judicial reform, that sort of thing. Those are kind of some of the main ones. And the more you're able to create that, or the more maybe you already have that, the better luck you'll have in reducing in your corruption and maintaining a relatively low level of corruption. So those are some of the main sort of points I want you to get about corruption. Globally, it's sort of the usual suspects. The less developed you are, generally the higher your corruption level is. So the places that are least corrupt are the ones we might expect. Those sort of Scandinavian countries, Northern, Western, European, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And then you'll find, like a lot of things, the U.S. is definitely worse, more corruption than those countries, but less corrupt than almost everybody else. So they're kind of in this in-between states. The best of the rest, or if you want to say it like that, are the worst of one of the worst of the developed world. We've seen the U.S.'s corruption ranking under Trump get significantly worse over the last couple of years. And now we'll see what happens with a new administration, and perhaps the ranking will get better, or perhaps real damage has been done. So that's what I wanted to tell you about corruption. I'll leave it there. And our next snippets will be on political violence, Chapter 7. Still catching up quite a bit, so I'll have those snippets out there for you, the Chapter 7 material out there for you over the next couple of days. And that's all for now. Talk to you later.